Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, Episode 10, Cibola or Bust. Last time we covered the fate of Esteban and the beginnings of the Coronado expedition, leaving them with Coronado creating a vanguard to clear the way for the Spanish. Melchor Diaz was dispatched to explore the Abra, an area Fray Marcos had discovered to the west. If he needed more time, he would meet up with Coronado later. From Jaramillo, who had been sent with Diaz, quote, "Thus it was done, but all we found there was some poor Indians, settled in a few valleys in the manner of rancherias. The land was sterile. The distance from the river to this arroyo must have been an additional 5 days' journey." End quote. This, of course, led to more grumbling among the men. Upon arrival in Corazones, Coronado immediately set to work. They procured food from the north and sent messengers to the coast to see where Alarcon was and to scout the people who lived on the coast. The reports back were mixed. Ships had been sighted, but they could have been Portuguese. More importantly, the reports of the people living on the coast included that they had little food. As we'll see later, Coronado continued to worry about the location of Alarcon and the food situation. The vanguard especially so. The vanguard would continue on to Chichitikal, which may have been the... And I apologize if I... The vanguard would continue on to Chichiticale. The vanguard would continue on to Chichitikal, which may have been, and I apologize, the Kukendal route. The vanguard would continue on to Chichitikal, which may have been the The vanguard would continue on to Chichitikal, which may have been the Kukendal ruins, of which Castaneda would write, quote, "The house was built of brown or red earth. Must have been quote, "The house was built of brown or red earth. Must have been despaired by the natives of the region, who are the most barbarous people thus encountered. They live by hunting and in rancherias, without permanent settlements." End quote. This area marked the edge of the Despoblado, an uninhabited and harsh area. They rested here for a few days. They wanted to stay longer so the horses could recover, but their food situation was getting worse and they decided they needed to make tracks. Coronado was definitely starting to worry about why they hadn't been able to meet with Alarcon yet. The Spanish were learning that they were further away from the coast than they had thought. Many things Fray Marcos had proved false. Coronado wrote in a letter about these issues, quote, "We all now became very distrustful and felt great anxiety and dismay to see everything that was the reverse of what he had told your lordship. The Indians of Chichitikal say that when they go to the sea for fish or for anything else they need, it takes them 10 days, and this information, which I have obtained from the Indians, appears to me to be correct. The sea turns towards the west for 10 or 12 leagues, directly opposite Los Corazones, where I learned that sight had been caught of the ships of your lordship, which had gone in search of the port of Chichitikal. In the 35th parallel, the father said, 'God knows that I have suffered, because I fear they have met some mishap. If they follow the coast, as they said they would, as long as the food lasts, which they took with them, and if they have not been overtaken by some misfortune, I may maintain my trust in God that they already may have discovered something good, for which their delay may be pardoned.'" End quote. At this point, Cardenas would be sent about a day's march ahead to scout the route for the men and prepare camps. This section was the hardest part of the trek. They continued to the Gila River and followed it to the north, where they forded the White River, somewhere near Fort Apache, Arizona. At this point, their pace began to slow as the men and horses were starting to get tired. They were also getting even hungrier. As they entered July, things were getting bad. They were tired, hungry, and Alarcon was nowhere in sight. Although there is some evidence that the Europeans on the expedition had maintained full rations, while the rations for the others involved had been cut. I do want to note that the expedition was mostly relying on indigenous guides and roads. They did very little to deviate from this route, unless they had to for the cattle they brought. They were here to profit, not explore. They would encounter approximately 17 languages too, which would mean they needed chains of interpreters. We'll talk about all this later in the story of Coronado as well. Cardenas was again sent ahead to try and find food for the men. Cardenas and his group would continue to the Little Colorado, supposedly where Fray Marcos had met with his companions. At this point, they met a group of Cibolans, who said food would be given the next day. The Spanish would keep 2 of these 4 to ensure they got the promised food. Alvarado was sent back to give this report to Coronado, who quickly caught up with the rest of the group. The Cibolans, known today to outsiders as the Zuni, had most definitely heard of the Spanish beforehand, whether from long-distant traders or through the grapevine. They were most definitely aware of Guzman, the previous governor of Nueva Galicia's slave raids, and that had probably colored their perceptions of the Spanish. Cardenas and his men were sent ahead to scout out for potential places for an ambush. Meanwhile, the main portion of the vanguard would cautiously follow behind. As they approached Hawaku, the first of the Cibolan pueblos, they would learn of a pass that would be perfect for an ambush, and that the people of the pueblo were up in arms. Cardenas was sent ahead to hold this pass until the vanguard could arrive. They encountered some Indian scouts, probably spies in reality. The Spanish would tell them that they came in peace and send them on their way. From here, Cardenas made camp. During the night, they would be attacked and their horses scared away. However, there were no mentions of any casualties on either side. A report was sent back to Coronado, who quickly pushed on, hoping for food or to avoid a military disaster. They made it through the pass near the modern New Mexico-Arizona border and would continue on until sighting Hawaku. What they saw would be nothing like the monumental cities that Fray Marcos had told them about. Castaneda gives a good account of the Spanish's disappointment about what they found. Quote, "Such were the curses some of the men hurled at Fray Marcos, that I pray to God to protect him from them." End quote. There is some confusion about when the Spanish arrived. It is possible they arrived during, and I apologize in advance, Olo Ikayayakyaka, which started on the solstice, which would have fallen on June 10th that year. The pueblo itself was ready for war. Some fighting-age men from nearby pueblos had also joined them. Meanwhile, the young, elderly, women, and valuables had been evacuated from all the settlements to the traditional Zuni stronghold of Doya Yalane. Some of the defenders had drawn up in front of the pueblo to challenge the Spanish. In total, there were about 200 people defending the pueblo. This form of a coalition defense hints at some larger integration between the Cibolan pueblos. The Spanish read the requerimiento to the pueblo, which they probably did not understand. As No Settlement, No Conquest put it, quote, "They were not unusual in that respect. There's no known case in which an indigenous group in the Western Hemisphere, without understanding what was being asked of it, acquiesced to the demands of the requerimiento." End quote. There are a few different accounts of how this encounter went hostile, and whether the Spanish actually understood everything that was going on when they brought on hostilities. One account, the defenders outside the village made lines of cornmeal on the ground, a common sign among the pueblos not to cross. Cardenas had been sent ahead to tell them that they came in peace. Not knowing about the meaning of these lines, they crossed them, and violence broke out. The other telling is that the Cibolans dared the Spanish to cross them. Cardenas was still sent ahead to tell them that they came in peace. At this point, they would set upon him and his men. Whether provoked or accidental, the Cibolans would set upon Cardenas and his men. The brief skirmish would end with no real damage done, other than one wounded horse. Coronado then moved in to try and keep peace himself. This supposedly emboldened the defenders, who then advanced on the Spanish. At this, Coronado conferred with the priests, and they all came to the agreement of a charge. Coronado would write, quote, "In obedience to the precepts of your lordship and his majesty, I did not wish them attacked, and although my men were begging me for permission, I enjoined them from doing so, telling them they ought not to molest them, that the enemy was doing us no harm, and that it was not proper to fight so small a number of people. On the other hand, when the Indians saw we did not move, they took greater courage, and grew so bold that they came almost to the heels of our horses to shoot their arrows. On this account I saw the time for hesitation had passed, and as the priests approved the action, I charged them. But there was little to do, for the Indians suddenly took flight, some running towards the city, which was near and well fortified, and others toward the plain, or wherever chance led them. Some of them were killed, and others might have been slain if I had allowed them to be pursued. But I saw that in this there would be little advantage, because the Indians who were outside were few, while those who retired to the city, added to the many who had remained there in the first place, were numerous." End quote. A small number of defenders were killed in the skirmish, and overall this account probably paints the Spanish in a better light than was probably true. Fray Marcos then sanctioned the Spanish to go after those who had retreated to the pueblo. Some flowery language can be given to try and justify the Spanish here, and having to defend their honor, but if you look at the practical situation, it's not needed. The Spanish needed food, and they were hungry. There was a promise of a meal inside of the pueblo. As was the style of the pueblo was functionally a fortified apartment complex. There were no entrances on the first floor. Instead, there were ladders that led to a series of terraces, and you entered from these terraces. In total, Hawaku was 6 levels high at its peak. In the show notes and website, I've shared a link to an example of what the Spanish encountered. These ladders could easily be pulled up to prevent access to the pueblo. There may have been an open area mostly surrounded by a wall. Defenders had furthermore collected stones to augment their capabilities to defend beyond just the bow. In contrast, the Spanish were tired and hungry. The defenders had purposely left one ladder to the ground as a trap. Coronado deployed his cavalry to surround the pueblo. Coronado supposedly tried once more to resolve the situation peacefully, and the defenders answered with a shower of arrows. As a result, he called for a charge. This would immediately be stopped by a second shower of arrows, however. In response, Coronado ordered his crossbowmen and arquebusiers to fire on the terraces and create an opening. These were essentially useless, as between the broken strings on the crossbows and the men being too weak to use their arquebuses. The Spanish would try to take the first terrace. Coronado joined in the charge. The Spanish would find their entrance to be narrow and crooked, making it far harder to assault the pueblo. Coronado would be knocked down twice trying to climb the ladder. Near the end of the battle, he'd be knocked unconscious, and Cardenas would be knocked unconscious, and Cardenas would take charge and to accept the Pueblo's surrender a little over an hour after the attack begun. Most of the victory could be attributed to the Indian allies, who helped make up for the difference in number. The Spanish promised amnesty to those who wished to stay, but overall many chose to leave the Pueblo. While in the grand scheme of things, this could probably be called a draw at best. But to the men it felt different. It was a victory that provided food. One account describes it as such. Quote, God knows how frugally we had lived, and whether we could have eaten much more than we consumed on the day when His Grace entered the city of Granada. There we found something we prized more than gold or silver, namely plentiful maize and beans, turkeys larger than those in New Spain, and salt better and whiter than I had ever seen in my whole life. End quote. After the conquest, the Spaniards renamed the Pueblo Granada, quote, because it was reminiscent of the cramped and impoverished Moorish quarter of that city, called the Albaycin, which was characterized at the time by low adobe buildings, end quote. While the men rested at Hawaku, some local leaders would finally come to see Coronado. He would use this opportunity to invite the rest from the area to try and smooth everything over. Some from the Pueblo of Matsakaya took Coronado up on this offer, saying they would bring others. Coronado had not yet begun to talk about the wealthy cities that he had come in search of, instead informing these leaders of their obligations as subjects of the Spanish crown. While Coronado was hopeful, the Puebloans again packed up and left. Coronado sent embassies to the Pueblo of Matsakaya to see what had happened, arriving in early July. Here he asked to see the Lord of the Pueblo, despite having not seen anything that would denote such a rank in the European understanding of the world. An old man would heed this call and agree to try and get the leaders to meet with the expedition again. What followed was a conference where the Pueblo leaders, quote-unquote, agreed to become Spanish subjects and convert. They painted the fauna and flora of the region on hides which were sent back to Viceroy Mendoza. They also agreed to return to their homes, something they did not do at first but eventually would. Coronado gave his report on Cibola as such, quote, it now remains for me to talk about the 7 cities, the kingdom and province of which the Father Provincial gave your lordship an account. To make a long story short, I can assure you he has not told the truth in a single thing he has said, for everything is the opposite of what he related, except the name of the cities and the large stone houses. However, although they are not decorated with turquoise, nor made of lime or good bricks, nevertheless they are very good houses, 3, 4, and 5 stories high, and they have very good rooms with corridors, and some quite good apartments underground, which are built for winter and are something like hothouses, end quote. Of course, at the end there, he is talking about a kiva. He then continues, quote, the 7 cities are 7 little villages, all having the kind of houses I have described, and all within the space of 4 leagues. All taken together, they are called the Kingdom of Cibola. Each has its own name, and no single one is called Cibola, but collectively they have this designation. This one I am now lodged, and which I have called a city, I have named Granada, both because it has some similarity to that place, and in honor of your lordship. In it there are perhaps 200 houses, all surrounded by a wall, and it seemed to me that, together with the others which are not so enclosed, there might be a total of 500 houses. There is another town nearby, one of the 7, which is somewhat larger than this, and another of the same size as this one, the other 4 being somewhat smaller. I am sending your lordship a sketch of them all, and of the route. The skin on which the paintings is made was found here with the others. End quote. I'll take a break here to interject on Coronado's report. These 7 cities, and I apologize in advance if I continue to butcher this, Google was less than helpful, but the 7 cities were Quechibawa, Quaquina, Kayakma, Matsakaya, Halonawa, Chalowa, and of course, Hawaku. He then goes on to describe the people, climate, and plants. He talks about their religious beliefs as the Spanish understood them. In all, it is a large account of the people of this time, even if given through a colonial Spanish lens. The only thing of note for this podcast is his description of the people. Coronado puts it as such, quote, the people of these towns are fairly large, and seem to me to be quite intelligent, although do I not think they have the judgment necessary to build these houses in the way in which they are made. For most of them, the men are entirely naked, except for covering that required for decency. They have colored fabrics, like the one I am sending you. They do not raise cotton, because this country is extremely cold, but they wear mantas, such as you may see by the sample, and it is true that some cotton thread was found in their houses. They wear their hair on their heads like the Mexicans, and they are well formed and comely. I think they have many turquoises, but remove them with all the rest of their goods except the maize. When I arrived, I did not find any women here, nor any men under 15 or over 60, except 2 or 3 old ones, who remained in command of the young men and the warriors. 2 points of emerald and some little broken stones, rather poor, which approached the color of garnet were found in a paper under some stone crystals. I gave them to one of my servants to keep until they could be sent to your lordship, but he lost them, so they tell me." End quote. Finally includes this last thing of note. Quote, "The natives here have some very well-dressed skins, and according to what they tell me, they tan and color them where they kill the cattle." End quote. In this case, the cattle he is describing are really the American bison, or more commonly known as the buffalo. He then sent out messages to get more information of the surrounding area. He learned that the kingdom of Totonteac was actually a single kingdom on a small lake. He also learned that Acoma was not as large a kingdom as previously depicted, and it was instead a single village. It seemed that Marcos had gotten everything wrong. At the end of this series, we'll discuss how much of a liar Fray Marcos and others really were. He would also hear of a kingdom called Tusayan, which may have been the southernmost Hopi pueblo, called Awatovi. He did write about all of this somewhat skeptically, though. Quote, "They could not tell me much about the others, nor do I believe that they are telling me the truth, because they think that in any case I shall soon have to depart from among them and return home. But here is where they are mistaken." End quote. They also heard about the kingdom of Tiwesh around this time. Captain Pedro de Tovar and Father Juan Padilla were sent with 21 men to follow up on this lead for the Hopi pueblos, though. They left on July 15th, about a week after Hawaku was taken. Castaneda wrote about this journey, quote, "When they arrived there, they entered the land so secretly they were not noticed by a single person. The reason for this being that the two provinces there are neither towns nor country houses, nor do the people go outside of their pueblos any further than to their fields." End quote. The reason they were staying in their pueblos were probably because of rumors of the conquest of Cibola, which included, quote, "men who were riding about on animals that devoured people." End quote. They tried to remain hidden at the first village they came to, but they were discovered the next day after making camp. The Hopi ordered the Spanish to leave, and the Spanish demanded the Hopi render obedience to the king. Lines were once again drawn in cornmeal, and the Spanish again crossed them. Eventually, all of this quite literally came to a head when a horse was hit on the head with a club. Before things could escalate further, more Hopi would rush down from the pueblo with gifts to ease tensions. Here they heard about a great river to the west, a common tactic used by the people Coronado encountered to divert attention to some nearby quote-unquote richer settlement. Hoping that this was the same river that Alarcon was to be exploring, Coronado would set up an expedition. But we'll have to wait until next time to hear about how that went. As a reminder, I have a map of the routes taken by the early explorers of New Mexico on the website. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.